Hello and welcome. My name is James Kleine-Kracht, and this is my Capstone project for the Applied Data Science course at Path University. My project is about using data science to leverage social media for customer feedback. The question behind my project is, how do we understand our customers? How can we better get their feedback and understand how to advertise or sell to them? We have to figure out, what do they want, honestly, before they know what they want. One of these things is Nielsen ratings. We also look at streaming numbers for media. This can show us how many people are actively watching our TV shows or movies. We can also give our customers surveys. We do this after a purchase of an item or after a call into a customer service line. We're trying to better understand ways that we can help our customers. We also look at product reviews. This is where we look at Amazon or Yelp reviews if we're a restaurant and try to better understand what our customer is enjoying or disliking about our product. All of these have advantages, but they also have disadvantages. The Nielsen rating, you require to actually have aired your show. You're required to wait for the ratings to come back, and then you can understand what to greenlight or to cancel when it comes to TV. For surveys, it requires a high amount of your customers to answer the survey. If someone just hangs up, we don't get any information from them. When it comes to product reviews, we often see a odd alignment that is primarily either 1-star reviews or 5-star. We don't find many reviews for the middle of the group. But the final end-all be-all when it comes to understanding our customer is sales. We try to understand what they're actually buying and what they are potentially going to buy. Our goal is to look at sales numbers and to use that to go forward. But the issue with sales is that you have to wait until your customer actually purchases the item. Maybe there's something that we can use that would predate that. What about social media? Social media is a thing that the customer is giving away for free, stating their opinions online, that we could potentially leverage using data mining and text mining to understand what the customer is looking for or how they are reacting to certain things. The corporation I will be looking at is the Disney Company. They have many products and experiences that we can look at and investigate. They have Disney Parks, Disney Media, as well as some Disney services. They also have a really high Twitter engagement, so I will be focusing on Twitter. They currently have 9.3 million Twitter followers and just have a great outreach through their social media and advertisements. It's a great example of a large company that we can look at to see how they handle customer feedback through social media. And we can try to put ourselves in their shoes when it comes to designing this project. When we come to trying to narrow down our topics, we could pick something that is part of their Disney experiences, such as the Disney Parks, Disney Cruise Lines, or even their timeshare, the Disney Vacation Club. We could look primarily at their media services, looking at Disney Animations or Pixar, or even Marvel and Star Wars. We could also look at services such as Disney Plus or Run Disney, their marathon company. For my project, I'm primarily focusing on Disney Parks and Marvel and Star Wars. What this allows me to do is compare across them, across like keywords and like products, to see what the differences are between the two. It will also allow us to look at, when looking at their media, 2 new shows that have been released and seeing how they are actively engaging with their Twitter followers, with Marvel just having released their series She-Hulk and Star Wars just having released its series Andor. But not only is Disney a large company that we can work with, I also have a personal connection to Disney. I have been a major fan of Disney since I was a child. I have been coming to Disney World quite frequently and have been to multiple parks across both the country and the world. I currently live in Orlando, so I see that Disney is not just the parks here. They have so much more to offer, and they have so much data that they collect and use that this is definitely something that I can see Disney working on. The other thing is that Disney is an extremely popular brand, and that's partially because they sell nostalgia. They are in the art of selling you a product from your childhood that has been rebranded or remerchandised and having you interact with that again, which leads to people of a generation that have Twitter and are actively on Twitter interacting frequently with their products. This is a great tool for us to use when trying to gauge that feedback. Another thing to note is that currently Disney relies very heavily on surveys for park feedback. When you enter the park, you will sometimes be asked to answer a quick survey. It's generally about 3 to 5 questions, and it's asking you things like how often do you come, or how many times have you been in the last year, or what your current feedback is for them. And while this is great for getting feedback from actual customers that you can guarantee are there, you're also limited by how many people you can ask in a day. What if we could ask everyone that comes in, or see anybody who has social media and see their feedback? This is where my project comes in. In my project, I use many different types of technology. The first one being the Twitter Developer Interface, or Twitter API. What this allows you to do is to search Twitter's large database of tweets and find ones that are related to your keyword search. In my project, I was looking to get roughly 500,000 tweets. That was where I deemed the goal of big data being. And then what you do with those tweets is that you apply text mining methodologies. With this, you can break down the content of those texts. You can learn more about your customers from what the actual text is in there, as well as do some pre-processing to help you condense what your customer is trying to tell you in their tweets. One of these text mining methodologies is sentiment. Sentiment is looking at the positive or the negative score of a text message. We look at those and we try to understand what our customer is saying to us. The first thing that I dealt with was the Twitter interface. It allows for keyword searches, so you can search for things like Disney World, and it will return to you any data that they have within the last 7 days. Now, within this query, you can add additional stipulations, such as only wanting certain geolocations if the tweet has that allowed, or looking for things that have media attached to them if you're looking for pictures and other websites that they're trying to link to, and finding what's connected to your product. But this API will actually return to you the author ID, which is the unique identifier that Twitter uses for your username. It will return the date of the tweet, as well as the text of the tweet. There are additional things that it can return if you ask for, but primarily I was focused on these 3 things. The challenges of working with the Twitter API were that your keyword needs to be extremely specific. When I was doing searches for the Magic Kingdom, one of Disney's parks, I would get a lot of these tweets that I was very confused about, but they had the word magic in them. I ended up getting nearly 10,000 tweets about the Orlando Magic NBA team. And so I had to tweak my keywords and tweak how the query was happening for the Twitter API to get exactly what I wanted back. The other thing was that there are a lot of automated Twitter robots. What they do is they will post wait times, or they will let you know if there's any fast passes or Genie Plus left for the parks, as well as what the overall attendance is in the park. And I had to go through and filter out these automated systems. The other thing is that it returns retweets. So if the first tweet has the message in there, I would end up getting back hundreds and thousands of messages that someone was just retweeting of those. That doesn't really provide a lot of insight into what the general public is thinking. It is more of just people saying, oh, I kind of agree with what that person is saying, or oh, this is interesting. It is a good gauge for Twitter engagement as a whole, but not necessarily for what I was looking for in the sentiment. Next, we come to the part of our text mining methodologies, which is pre-processing. We have to look at the uppercase versus the lowercase. So in this our situation, Disney, we want to make sure that anytime someone says Disney, we match those together. So if they capitalize the D or they have it all lowercase, we want to make sure that those are the same in our system and how our software is handling it. Stop words are also having to be removed. These include things like a, and, or the. These are words that we use as fillers within our text that we're trying to cut down on and trying to reduce the amount of noise within our text. Another process is stemming, where you're trying to get words back to their root. This can be cars and cars. You want to make them car together. Or run and running. You want them both to be run. This allows you to reduce the amount of noise again within your text and allows your AI to work better with it. Another thing that we see a lot in social media, especially on Twitter or Facebook, is misspellings. Now, it is very difficult to deal with large scale misspellings, but what we can do is if we have a topic, Disney, and we know that some people may be using jargon or misspellings on purpose, we can try to adjust those to all be the same. It's kind of like stemming and trying to get things back to their roots. Another thing is text speech, which is very difficult to handle with pre-processing and handling emojis or multiple punctuations, all those things that we often use on Twitter, but are not necessarily English language or, part of that text. And so we have to find ways to deal with that. Thankfully, there's a tool out there called Vader, which is Valence Aware Dictionary for Sentiment Reasoning. What Vader does is gives you a sentiment score, which is a combination of polarity and intensity of a word for any text you give it. So when you give it a sentence, what it will do is it will give you the average sentiment for everything in that sentence. This then gives you a compounded score between -1 and 1. So our negative, oh, this is, someone didn't like Disney World. Okay, that's towards the -1 side. Whereas, oh, they had a positive experience, that is more towards the 1 scale. The other great thing about Vader is that it handles emojis, it handles Twitter formatting, and it handles what we consider emphasis context, which is full capitalization of a word or multiple punctuation, all those things that we use in social media to provide more emphasis onto our message. What Vader does is he gives every single word or emoji or punctuation a different score. And so what they have been able to do is simply provide the smiley face emoji with a positive score and a high intensity that allows it to handle that sort of situation. It can also handle context well, whereas so if you include not, what it'll do is it will flip the polarity of anything coming after it. It's a great tool to work with and is a very neat open source and easy to use product. So let's kind of look at some of these tweets that I actually got in my messages, and we can kind of look at whether or not we consider them positive or negative. So this first tweet we see is talking about someone having a great day walking around Disney World, and while they didn't ride anything, they still had a fantastic time eating food and enjoying the weather. It was, so that is clearly a positive message. The next one we see here is someone who wasn't a big fan of the Andor Star Wars series, another one of my topics, that and we can look at that message and then go, okay, that's a negative score. So the goal is to automate this process. Here's an example. This is an example of a tweet response that I got from Twitter API. And you can see that it has the date, the text, the ID value for the actual tweet, as well as the author ID. Now, what we do is then take that text message and run it through Vader and get back a sentiment score. So this one, which is talking about She-Hulk, and says, hey, it was actually good, multiple exclamation marks, we have LOL in there. Vader's able to handle that and says, hey, overall, this is a positive remark. We can mark this as a positive thing, and we can, give us back that feedback. This is a great tool for attacking and using on general tweets. Let's get into some of the details of my project. For this project, I chose 7 different topics. The first 2 being Disney World and Disneyland, so that we can get a comparison for how the customer feedback is when we look at Disney World, the park in Florida, Orlando, Florida, as well as Disneyland, which is many of their parks globally. As well, I wanted to look at Epcot and Magic Kingdom, 2 of the smaller parks within Disney World. I feel that this will give us a great outlook onto which park is performing well or what may be going on in Disney World itself. I also grabbed Disney Plus, the standalone streaming service from Disney. This will allow us to see a product that is standalone and see how the customers are reacting to something that was a continuous thing throughout this time period. Andor Star Wars and She-Hulk Marvel are 2 new TV series that were released on Disney Plus. I feel that these provide me a great comparison as well as a lot of Twitter engagement. As you can see, Andor and She-Hulk are vastly the largest amount of my total tweets. In total, I got nearly 700,000 tweets from between the time period of September 19th to October 16th. After some pre-processing to reduce any errors from Twitter or messages that were in languages not supported by Vader, I got down to nearly 500,000 tweets. This is a large amount of tweets, but is nowhere near the amount that Disney would have access to if they were to run this for longer periods of time or across more of their products. When you're looking at this in the eyes of a corporation, this is merely a drop in the bucket of what Disney would be able to handle for themselves, as well as what they would be interested in looking at. I took some broader topics here, whereas Disney may try to get way more specific on something or could go much broader. They could just look at Disney and see what people are feeling for their brand as a whole. This can help show brand loyalty or overall how a product has been released or announced. There are plenty of great opportunities to look at tweets or Facebook statuses and just gather that information. And as a large company as Disney, I think that is viable to do now. Diving into our text data, we can see here 4 word clouds that I created based on the text and the tweets that I gathered. On the top left, we can see Disneyland. This shows us multiple hashtags that are being used in relation to any message using the words Disneyland. You can see the word key here, which relates to their FastPass system or their priority line queuing. You can also see the magic is here, which is a great, hashtag to have associated with your product. Magic Kingdom, we can see over here. You can see that many references to Magic Kingdom also include Disney World. As well, they also include words like or love, which is a great sign for the park as a whole. We can see here that the word closed is a large portion of this word cloud. I feel like that can reference either a ride being down or closed, which is something that frequently may occur for Magic Kingdom, but it can also be referencing the Hurricane Ian that came through. Disney World closed in one of its very rare moments, and that could be causing a large amount of tweets to be referencing Magic Kingdom being closed. In the bottom left, we look at Marvel's She-Hulk. As you can see, this is a hashtag is very common, and we can also see that people talked about characters that may be in the show. Daredevil. This is an interesting idea that we can see common threads across these tweets. We also see words like finale and final, as the finale was being played during this time period and seems to have created a large amount of Twitter engagement. For Star Wars Andor, we see very similar comments in here. We also see words like love, which is great. And we also see things like three. Now, why this is interesting is that Star Wars Andor, when it premiered, which was during this time period, released 3 episodes at once. Maybe we could filter down to those tweets that include the word three and see if that was a good idea or not. And that is a very interesting way to go. Looking at Twitter engagement, we can see for Disney World, we can see when people were tweeting. This is a chart showing from the beginning of our time frame to the end, as well as showing how many tweets were on these topics. We can see this large spike in the middle that is people tweeting about Epcot. And you may be thinking, why is that day particularly important? Well, it was Epcot's 40th anniversary. This shows that word got out about the anniversary and anything going on, and people were reacting to it, which is a great sign for Epcot. If that date had gone by and nothing had changed, that may be a sign that Disney needs to try harder on their social media to get people to interact with the Disney product. We can also see that, for the most part, Twitter engagement is pretty steady for most of these things. Disney World has a few spikes in here, which may be related to the storm coming through, which was around October 5th, which is, people were more focused on doing other things. So we see a slight dip there. And we can look at that and judge how Disney is doing as a whole, where they may be needing to provide additional advertisement or what they could capitalize on. Next, let's look at Marvel versus Star Wars and their Twitter engagement. So we can see a couple of spikes here in this data. We can see that the first spike for Andor, the blue line, is on the Andor release date, which is a great sign. It means that on the day it came out, there was a lot of conversation and engagement about it. We also see that on the spikes for the She-Hulk's second to last and final episode, this is a reference to perhaps a cliffhanger or something that occurred on this episode that caused it to be so much higher than the others. We also see that the finale had nearly 30,000 tweets on it immediately on that day, which is a great sign for Disney. It means that people are really talking about it and the word is getting out about the show. You can also note that there's a weekly release pattern, and we see spikes and slow burn downs in between for where the release of an episode is for each of these shows. Now, Andor seems to be slowly going down through this time, but perhaps when Andor's finale comes out, we will see another spike similar to how we saw Hulk go up. Now let us dive into the actual sentiment of these tweets. First, let me explain what we're seeing in these charts. This is the average sentiment score per day. So we're looking at a change over time in our sentiment. You can see the red line that goes through all of these is the 0 line. Anything above that is considered a positive message, whereas anything below it is considered negative. Overall, we can see that Disney has positive messaging throughout many of their services. Andor, however, seems to fall routinely below that line. I believe this could be that either the show is not performing very well for the fan base, or that the Star Wars fan base is extremely stingent in the praise that they give. We have seen this before with the sequels and the prequels for Star Wars. As culture has it, we tend to not like those. It seems to be the trend that we see out there. And so people may be playing off that and referencing those, and that may be causing this value to go down. We also see that for many of these, it's pretty stable over time. As we can see on this chart in the top left, Disney World versus Disneyland, they each equally rotate just slightly above the zero line, never going too high, but never falling below it. Disney World has some more variance in it than Disneyland does, but it does seem to be overall positive remarks for each of these. Disney Plus, we can see that as time goes on, it is relatively even and straight across the top of this positive remarks. However, we see one dip here in the Disney Plus, which if we compare it to the charts down here, may relate to the Andor dip we see right here. As Andor is on Disney Plus, frequently they share tweets. Looking at Epcot versus Magic Kingdom, we can see a lot of variance in this messaging. We see a lot more harsh spikes as each day is different. This could be because we have far fewer tweets about them and we have far fewer information as a whole. This is just generally because the engagement is much smaller with these parks. There are fewer people interacting with them on a daily basis or using Twitter to discuss them. So we often see it like this. Now we do see couple spots here where Magic Kingdom and Epcot get very close or below the zero line. Disney might be able to look through and see what occurred on that day. Perhaps on October 3rd, there was a bad storm that caused, the park to close down on some of the rides, and people were upset about this. Or perhaps it was overly crowded more than expected. This also lines up roughly with where this bump right here, this positive spike, lines up with the Epcot anniversary. So we can see that perhaps more positive things are being said about Epcot on its anniversary than it is on a normal day. Now, the real interesting thing is down here in our bottom right. We can see the difference between the two competing shows on Disney Plus, the green line being She-Hulk, while the blue line being Andor. We see that She-Hulk is getting overwhelmingly positive remarks. This means that the sentiment for She-Hulk is great. Disney has hit it out of the park with this one, especially compared to their Andor series, and we can see that it is continually above even the other spikes of other topics. It is above this zero point 0.2 line, which when you get to averages is really high. And when we look at Andor, we see it is always low. This could be an issue with Vader, that perhaps there's something going on there that is more difficult to do. But in all the additional pre-processing I did, it just seemed that the overall sentiment for this show is lower than that for She-Hulk. But with this information, we can now compare release strategies of She-Hulk and Andor. Maybe She-Hulk got better advertising towards the end, and when every episode comes out, it is what Disney Plus is pushing, and it is what is being pushed on the internet. And we can look at that and say, hey, maybe this is the way Disney should do things going forward. We can see overall what a great job they've done with She-Hulk and compare that to what they've decided to do with Andor. Maybe future Disney Star Wars shows may try to do something more similar to how She-Hulk is handling it. Now, looking at total sentiment percentage, this is across the entire board. So this is looking at the product as a whole across the board and how people favor it. We have 19.5% of messages for Disney Plus are negative. Nearly 50% are what we consider neutral, which means that either the positive comment outweighs the negative, or they used a lot of neutral language and are more just stating facts rather than actually giving positive sentiment to it. And we can see that nearly 34% are positive messaging about Disney Plus. This is what you would expect to see. You would expect to see a majority of neutral messages and then two ends, either positive or negative, being higher than the other. We can see a few outliers in this data though. We see that Epcot is nearly 50% positive remarks. I think this is because the 40th anniversary for Epcot was in this and maybe biasing that data. So if you're Disney and you're trying to find a product as a whole over a long period of time, you have to look at where these outliers might be. Additionally, with She-Hulk, we can see 58% positive messaging for them. This is fantastic news for Disney and shows that She-Hulk has been a great hit. And this is all data that we've been able to get without paying for surveys, without paying for Nielsen ratings, without having to constantly, badger your customers to answer, messaging. It's all data that the customer is willing to give to us for free, which just means that we need to find more ways to leverage it. Now, in contrast to the success that She-Hulk was, we can see that Andor has a majority of negative reviews. There are a couple things that confuse me about this, as I have heard great things about the show personally, as well as seen reviews that have talked highly of it. Now, this could be that there was overhype for the product, and maybe we need to address that in our advertisements, or maybe the customer was expecting a certain product and we ended up giving them something else. That could also be an issue. Another thing to note is that with Star Wars, where you're dealing with something that's connected to something so culturally part of our lives, people could talk about Andor, but might also be mentioning other things like the prequels or the sequels when it comes to Star Wars. In the future, if I were to come back to this, perhaps I could filter that down more or try to understand what the issue is there. I also wonder if there are certain things that are coming up in this that I'm not meaning to. But for the most part, Andor Star Wars seem to be a pretty concise keyword search in the Twitter API, so I'm not really sure if that's the issue. Perhaps it is just that the customer feedback is that they prefer She-Hulk over Andor, which is a completely fine decision to make, but it's more data would be needed before we decide to overhaul how we are handling Andor itself or future Star Wars shows. But all of that information is here in this tweet download that we are able to do. We can gather from this data and move forward and continue to test and look at other shows. All of these things are the future of customer feedback. Why stop at Twitter? Let's throw in Facebook. Let's throw in all this other data that the customer is giving us and see what we can do to help create a better product and happier customers overall. In review, we can look at the sentiment over time comparison because this is where I feel most of our data and most of the useful information we would have as a company might come from. We can see that in our top left corner, we see that Disney World and Disneyland overall net positive and very stable in their position. They never fall below zero, but they never really get much higher than zero point 0.2. Maybe this is something that we could investigate and look into to see if there's something we could do to boost that customer feedback. Or maybe this is just something that involves Twitter engagement, and that's not really where that community is talking to us. Looking at Disney Plus, we can see that likewise, it is staying in that 0 to 2, that zero point 0.2 range. However, we see at the end, we see a little bit of a bump. Perhaps that has to do with the shows that we have going on currently or other products that may be looked at. And we can dive more into that data in that spot. This is a great way to give us a guide of where to put our efforts. Looking at Epcot and Magic Kingdom, we see that it is a wild pattern. There's a lot of ups and downs and mountains and valleys to this data. We see some great spikes from Epcot, but we also see some very low valleys from Magic Kingdom. This is something we should look into more to see if there's something that went on that day that is the issue, or what our concerns might be. Looking at She-Hulk, we can see that it is an extremely positive reviewed show from our audience, that the Twitter community is really enjoying it, and that overall we see a lot of positive remarks. On the other hand, looking at Andor, we see that it is primarily negative. And we have to figure out what that means for it as a product and what we would like to look at going forward. Maybe we aren't doing Andor season 2 and we go a different direction with the Star Wars franchise. Perhaps we can look at what Mandalorian gave us and see if that show is a better option for us moving forward. Using this information, we can decide future products and we can decide where to spend our money and time when it comes to a large company like Disney. So that is the overview of my data and the results that I had for this project. While working on this project, there's plenty that I learned and plenty of places that a large corporation like Disney could add improvements. The first thing that I interacted with was the Twitter API. Now, for my account type, I could get 2 million total tweets per month, and I could only go back the last 7 days. Now, if I had an elevated access, something that Disney as a corporation would be willing to pay for, you can then use the history tweets and go back to tweets of all time that they still hold. This would be a great tool for Disney to provide large scale comparisons for their products. You wouldn't be limited only what is happening within a very short period of time, but could instead see year-long trends in your sentiment. You could also see how announcements paid off at the 1 month mark, at the 1 year mark, or even at the 5 year mark. So you can see how a release of an idea by Disney could potentially show much larger gains when having that elevated access from the Twitter API. Another spot that I saw improvement was when working with Vader. Vader is a fantastic tool and is a great entry-level spot for someone working with social media or tweets and trying to find their sentiment. It does a great job with general tweets, but when you're getting more specific with topics, it tends to have issues interacting with certain ideas. So you could have another version of Vader or another technology stack that has been trained instead of on just general tweets. You could train it on tweets that are talking about TV shows. And then, okay, this is what's good or bad when related to TV. And then you can have a more accurate representation of the sentiment of your values and products. The other thing with Vader is that I had to do more pre-processing than I thought necessary. When you look at Vader as a whole, it claims that it can do a lot on its own, but I think because I was working with so many things that had jargon or, terms that are very independent to, their topics, it seemed to be an issue. Now, on the other side, other things I learned was that it's not always easy to display the graphics of sentiment. As you can see from my previous slides, I was posting things that are referencing over time or just in a bulk. It's very difficult to show the sentiment of a product for certain spots or really do great comparisons between them. You kind of get bogged down in the number of data points that you have in there. I think the other thing is that when you're using a survey, there are very easy buckets to put them in. You either have a 5-star rating or a 1 star. You have, a scale out of 10. But when you're using something like a sentiment score, you almost have too many options of where that value could fall. And so I think if I were to continue doing this, or if Disney were to do something like this, the way that I would do it is to have things and put them into buckets. Take anything between a zero point 0.8 and 1 score and say that's a 10 out of 10, and do the inverse of that for something that would be negative. I also think that there are plenty of other data points out there that I would have been very interested to look at. I think if I had stepped out of the Disney bubble, I could have compared Andor, She-Hulk, compare those to the HBO show of the House of Dragon or the Amazon show Rings of Power, and see how Disney stacks up against the competition. When you're a large company and you're working with this data, you have access to all of that data. There's no data out there that, oh, it mentions HBO, thus Disney can't use it. No, it is free to use. You are placing that into a public space. And so by doing that, you could have a much larger view than just how am I doing against myself. But overall, I feel like with this project, I've learned a lot more about data science, and I have learned about how to relate the things that I have done in this coursework and place them into the mindset of a corporation or of a business. And I think that proves that the data that is out there is something that we should be leveraging in every possible way. If we just leave it sitting on the table, all we're doing is leaving innovation and future improvements on the table as well. Thank you very much.